Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm Hilary.salt.
And I'm Sebastian.moore.
And this is one of our news items this week. We don't have a guest this week, but we're going to dive into a couple of the items in the news at the moment. So, Sebastian, you're going to talk about...
Denby.
I
had to
pottery.
think for a second there. Yeah, Denby pottery.
Okay. And I am going to talk about inflation. So, do you want to go first?
Yeah,
Are
let's
you
do
okay?
it. Whilst it's fresh in my mind, let's crack on. So, Denby pottery. Do you own any Denby pottery?
I do have some Denby pottery.
I remember when I was a kid, my parents had some Denby pottery. I remember, I can't think what it would have been for, but we used it for something. And I remember my parents saying, "No, that's Denby!" And getting really annoyed at us. It was really special for them. I think it was a wedding gift. They had a load of plates and crockery.
Yes.
So Denby is a very old British company.
Yep.
Based in...
Denby.
Yeah, it's named after the village in Derbyshire.
Yes, okay.
It was founded in 1809.
Okay.
So 217 years old.
Okay.
But as of this week, it is at risk of collapsing because the company has, and I said this to you beforehand, it has filed, what is it called? Applied for?
An application for administration. Yeah.
Which isn't to say it's going into administration, is that right?
My understanding is that means that they know that what they owe is more than what they can pay. And so they have to take the first steps along the road to administration because you're not allowed to trade as an insolvent business knowingly.
Okay. So they've got a lot of debts and they're worried that they're not going to be able to pay them, essentially.
Yes. Yeah. So money in the bank is less than the things that they owe everybody else. So
Denby's an interesting company because I think it is it represents, or it's symbolic of a lot of the problems with UK business. And we talked about Vassal State, a book by Angus Hanson.
We did.
About how a lot of British businesses are actually American owned. That was with our conversation with Jacob Reynolds last week.
Indeed.
And Denby, whilst it's a British company, it was bought out by Hilco Capital in 2009, £30 million. Now, Hilco Capital is a private equity firm, which is owned by Hilco Global, which is based in the US. Shock horror. But there's an element to this story around British businesses being foreign owned and how a lot of our industry has been hollowed out.
Yeah.
But also in regards to the problems that manufacturing companies face in the UK, something we talk about a lot in the SDP is energy problems. So in the UK, we have the highest industrial energy prices anywhere in the world. So industrial electricity is around 25 pence per kilowatt hour. Any guesses what it is in China or America?
7 or 8 pence?
Yeah, pretty much. So in China, it's about 6 pence, and in America, it's about 7 pence. Gas in the UK is about 5 times more expensive than in the US.
Okay.
And with an industry like pottery and ceramics, and I'm a novice at this, but a friend of ours here in Manchester has a pottery business and tells us all about it, and I've seen the kilns. These kilns work off gas, the gas-fired kilns.
Yep.
So they're incredibly energy intensive, and it's an industry where energy is a core component. It's not a byproduct. So restaurants, for example, you can find ways to reduce your energy bill and so forth, but it's very hard with something like pottery or ceramics because that is the only way to reduce your energy bill is to stop doing the thing which you're producing.
Yeah, I'm assuming you can't use a heat pump kind of energy source for firing pottery.
So, I mean, it is somewhat ludicrous to expect a company like Denby to be able to compete with companies in China, in America, and we've seen our markets flooded by cheap imports in the last 30, 40 years, and now a historical British-owned or British company is at risk of collapsing, and it's very sad.
Very sad, yes. And is there anything that anybody is intending to do about it? Government, for example?
I don't think so. I mean, there's about 500 jobs at risk. So, as we said, Denby is based in Derbyshire, but a lot of to my knowledge from our friend and from the discussions we've had, a lot of the pottery industry is around the Stoke area.
That's
Where
right.
there's the clay deposits.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
So I think a lot of that industry is pretty much on its knees.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't just Denby. I don't know if the government are going to step in or if there's any plans to save it. Denby themselves have been putting out tweets saying, here's what you can be doing. You can be buying Denby products. You can be signing a petition, know, and so forth. But so I don't know if there's what's going to happen with it. But I think we have to have a wider conversation about do we just let these things die? Something like a British institution like Denby.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring a plate out because if anybody that uses Denby will know they're pretty much indestructible. The ones my parents had, they'd had them for 30, 40 years, right? And that's one of the problems with their business model is that people don't often replace Denby products because they don't need to, whereas the cheap ones you might get from IKEA and other brands are available. You need replacing a lot more frequently.
Yeah. There's always this tension, isn't there, between saving a business and the kind of idea that I've argued before about there's lots of zombie businesses that we need to let them go. I mean, are there things that Denby should have been doing to make themselves more productive that they haven't been doing? Is there anything that you could say, well, actually, there's a reason we shouldn't rescue this business? I'm just being a devil's advocate to test that thesis.
I don't know, but if you create the conditions that we currently have with energy prices where they are, and a lot of and I don't know if, I'm not an expert in the pottery industry, but a lot of the regulation problems that many industries face in the UK, where it has a lot stricter regulations than other countries, you create those conditions for business, and then you expect them to compete with businesses in other countries. I just don't think that's realistic. And whatever they could be doing differently, they're never going to succeed if they're paying 5 times the price of energy than the US, for example, than China.
Yeah. And government does offer some subsidies to high energy users, doesn't it? It kind of feels like that's something that government should be exploring, because whenever you look at the cost of energy, a big chunk of it is either the extra that they're charging effectively to support the green transition, or it's amounts that are needed to pay for other developments to the infrastructure.
So we discussed this with Jacob Reynolds last week, the idea that he was saying that whilst he wants to be sort of a nationalist when it comes to businesses being British owned, there will be reasons why the American businesses are doing better. And actually, if we end up sort of with a government imposed solution, like saying, well, you must buy British, you're just going to end up with worse goods. And you and I discussed this after the podcast about this idea that you have to do both things. And I worry that too often, especially in our political environment where we're sort of led to believe there's no alternative, too often what the governments are doing, they're just sort of tweaking and they come in at the last second. And you mentioned this with steel.
Yeah.
Right, you could nationalise the steel industry, the stuff that was at risk in Hull. Was it Hull? Up that way. It's not Hull, is it? Scunthorpe.
No, Scunthorpe, yeah.
But then is that not just a different sort of bureaucratic ownership without that democratic overhaul? And I think that's true with something like Denby. It's like this casts light on so many of the problems with industry in the UK, and the fact that so much of our economy is now dependent on services, which isn't great when it comes to the jobs that it's offering people. And you were making the case at a talk last night about people having some sort of sight or perspective on what they've managed to create.
Yeah.
Right. And things like Denby are like real products. I said to you about this, a friend that was showing me her father was working in a factory and he had these brass plates from the factory that she still has. And I held them in my hands and it felt like it was from a different era, which of course it was, but like from a different world. It was just, that sort of thing now is unthinkable. Everything's plastic. I grew up in a plastic world, right? And everything, I remember as a kid, the first, like, such early memories of toys and looking at the underside of toys and it said made in China. And I remember once having a toy that said made in the UK, and I was really confused. I didn't understand because I thought, but we don't do that in this country. As like a really young child, I thought toys came from China, right?
Yeah. See, interestingly, my perspective is very different. So when I was young, people would turn things over and they go, "Oh, made in China, we're not buying that." Which, because they would think that's going to be going to be shoddily made, cheap, it'll break.
Right.
So they wouldn't my mum and dad would turn something over and if it said made in China, they'd put it down again.
So this story tells us we should be doing things differently when it comes to energy, when it comes to thinking about reindustrialization, something we talk about a lot. But it also tells us that it can't just be a government-imposed solution.
Correct.
Right? And it requires people to be aware of this, to be aware of where things are made and by whom. Right? And this is something that I've been blissfully unaware of for so much of my life. And now as an adult, needing to buy crockery and glasses and things, I'm actually starting to think about, well, where is this made? And is it good quality? Or am I just cheaping out? And I think we've grown, my generation at least, has been spoilt with cheap goods that we think are much better than the alternative. And actually we need to have a better understanding as a consumer of where things are coming from and potentially being more in touch with that. Like now I feel a sudden sense of patriotism towards Denby, a company I've not really thought about much in my life. And I'm thinking, okay, how can we get involved to save this company?
Yes, yeah. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because I think the other thing that's a bit different perhaps about your generation is that you're often quite keen to buy things that are old, that are second-hand, that have got a kind of history to them. Whereas for my generation, it was a kind of chuck it out and buy again kind of generation.
Yeah, that's true.
So, yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. I think seemingly like my friends and peers are much more willing to buy in charity shops than even just 5 years ago or 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've always bought clothes from charity shops, and it seems like that's much more in fashion nowadays.
Yeah. But with your generation.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've got to be really careful when we talk about this, about saying, oh, the whole of one generation is like this and the whole of another generation is like that. And certainly for my generation, for the kind of boomers, I think there's often an assumption that all boomers are rich. And that absolutely is not the case. But there's certainly, a cohort of boomers who are, who have done pretty well and do have quite a lot of disposable income. Obviously, these people have worked all their lives and, they've built up that store of wealth. But it always strikes me when I'm at kind of punk rock gig and you're thinking about the band, because the band are obviously generally very young, certainly for new bands. And I kind of think about them looking at the audience and thinking, oh, got the grannies and granddads in again. And, on one hand, you might think that they think, well, that's not great, we want the young people in. But on the other hand, they probably think, we'll do pretty well on the merch stall today.
Right.
So it's interesting, isn't it, to kind of compare and contrast those things. But I'm just wanting to put in a little, be careful warning that I think often the generational tensions get exaggerated by people jumping to the conclusion that all this generation is that and all that generation is this. I think we should judge people by the content of their character and the content of their wallets, not by kind of stereotypes that we invent.
So I'm wondering if there's a counter-argument to being very pro-Denby. And this is a very new thing for me. This is now my political ideology, would be pro-Denby. When a lot of people might say what you were talking about, letting zombie companies die. That sort of, what did you call it, creative destruction?
Yes.
Which I think you borrowed from Phil Mullen.
I did. Right? The phraseology, yeah.
Why is Denby different?
I mean, that's why I was trying to push you on it earlier. So I think if you posited a company that was perhaps had lots and lots of very old machinery, very old processes, hadn't introduced new technology, hadn't tried to move with ways in which that you can improve productivity, that's the kind of company that I would say is a zombie company. So, is there an argument that if you did slash and burn and let Denby go under, could you rebuild Denby 2 on a greenfield site in a much more productive way? And if you can, that's the kind of thing where I think it is actually possible to raise money to finance something like that. And sometimes you do need to let zombie companies die, particularly if they're loaded down with a lot of debt. Now, I don't know this because I've not looked at Denby's books, but when you say they're owned by Hilco,
yeah.
My guess is that Hilco borrowed a load of money to buy that company. And so a lot of the problems that Denby have are because they have a lot of overhang of debt. Now, if Denby Mark 1 dies, that debt dies with it. And then you rebuild Denby 2 without all that debt, perhaps by going to the local community or the community in the region and saying, can we find the money to buy a greenfield site and to rebuild, and maybe that's a better solution.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's a good test, right? The creative destruction test, patented by hilary.salt. And I think the answer would probably be in Denby's case that it has such an important history and knowledge that's been passed down, and that history and tradition is actually integral to the company itself and to a lot of its brand, and the people that feel a loyalty to its brand. So I'd say in Denby's case, it probably passes that test. A lot of companies wouldn't. Just on the sort of the protectionist angle of this, because I think in the SDP we're a lot more protectionist than the current establishment, which means that we do think it's important to recognise where we need to give an advantage to British-owned businesses over foreign imports. Now, where that doesn't apply, and I think a lot of people mistake protectionism, is for things where there is a clear comparative advantage for other countries. You take oranges, for example, is the sort of a classic one where it would be preposterous for us to try and create an orange industry to compete with Spain when Spain has such a clear comparative advantage when it comes to its climate, soil, so forth, right? Knowledge, that keen orange farming knowledge, I don't know. And why would we? Because oranges are not a strategic industry which can be used against you when you're vulnerable geopolitically, right? Energy is, however. This is why we need to think about energy independence. And something like the pottery and ceramics, that is an industry, I think, where we look at it and we go, we were a world leader in this.
Yeah.
Right, because a lot of it because of the natural geography of the clay pits, but then because of that, we had the right conditions at the sort of tail end of, if you think of 19th century, where we had an abundance of coal, we had much cheaper energy than we do now comparatively, and so the conditions were right for that industry to thrive.
Yeah.
Now we can create those conditions again. And it's probably worth doing that with something like ceramics and pottery. And maybe this is the traditionalist in me, but I think it's important to keep these industries, an industry like that, which has such a strong history rooted in the place. Yes. I think that's important to maintain.
Yeah. Yeah. But you could maintain it by setting up Denby 2. You could employ exactly the same people. It's just in the field next door.
Okay, if it had the same name and it had the same tradition, lineage. Okay.
Yeah. So I think those
Is that
are
a
the
business
tests
proposal?
that I would want to, really dig into. If you're looking to me to be the, what do they call it, the white knight who goes to rescue a company, that's all the things I would want to test,
Okay.
kick the tyres on.
Very good. All right, let's talk about inflation.
Yes.
Why is inflation in the news?
So today we had the announcement of the CPI and all the other inflation figures for February. We're recording this on Wednesday. And the main measure that people focus on, which is CPI, was 3%, which is unchanged from the previous month. Now, in some ways, that's not really news because it's really been overtaken by events. So you remember that the invasion of Iran was on, or the bombing of Iran, it's probably not an invasion without boots on the ground, is it? It was on the 28th of February. So, the impact of that on the price of oil and everything else isn't in the February figures. So I think...
Just to clarify, the February figures that's 3%. It's projection from February, but over the course of a year. Correct.
It's from February 2025 to February 2026. I think it's about 0.4 per month. It's kind of a figure that's interesting. Very briefly, only to say it doesn't mean very much because actually everything's changed now. I think in February, 1st of Feb, I think oil was about $70 a barrel. It's pushing about 100 now. So as we know, the price of oil doesn't just affect what you pay for your petrol. It affects the price of food because lots of food is moved around the country. It affects the cost of lots and lots of things we do. We know that some of the effects of the conflict will be on things like fertiliser prices as well. So we do expect a real, addition to inflation going forwards. It's almost news but not news that it was 3% in February. So now you're going to say to me, why are you doing this as a news item when you're telling me it's not news? And what I'm going to say to that is that the other thing that we heard last week was, I don't know if you know this, but all our inflation figures are based on what they call a basket of goods. And every year they update that basket of goods to reflect the fact that things have changed, the society has changed. So if you think about it, if you wanted to know what your rate of inflation was, that would be very particular to you. It would depend on how much you spend on fuel, how much you spend on pop, how much you spend on food, how much you spend on holidays, all those kind of things.
And what I'm buying in my life might not have been affected by inflation as much as what somebody else is buying.
Absolutely.
And this is why they have this basket of goods that tries to represent everybody. Is that right?
Something typical. Yeah. So it's meant to be a typical measure of what inflation is. But lots of people have argued that particular elements of the population, so pensioners, for example, perhaps spend more on fuel and staple goods, and so their rate of inflation would probably be quite different to somebody else's who spends a lot more money going out and going on holiday. So you could say, inflation is really difficult to measure a typical rate of inflation, but we have to do that, so we have to try to do it. And interestingly, what ONS are going to do from this year, not quite yet this year, but later on this year, is to take in information from the scanning software that supermarkets use. So they've got a much better idea of what actually goes through the till rather than what they think a typical basket is.
And how's that come about? Have they requested from supermarkets? Have they made it a legal requirement?
No, they just requested it, and supermarkets are keen to help. So yeah, it's anonymised, to be clear. They're not saying what you've bought. They're just saying what the aggregate amount that's gone through the scanner is. So you might say that a typical basket of goods, if you look at the history of that, it gives you quite an interesting flavour of what's changed in a society. So, for example, corned beef used to be in the basket of goods and it isn't now. Charcuterie He's in it now.
What's corned beef?
Well,
I'm kidding, I'm
it's like,
kidding.
what's charcuterie?
Yeah.
So the generation divide there.
That's probably, that's a perfect description of the difference between me and you in this podcast. It's like corned beef, charcuterie.
Exactly. Yeah. So some things, go out and other things come in. Some things actually go out and come in again. So frozen prawns, I think, went out in the early 90s and then came back in the 2000s because they, came back into fashion. Honey went out at one point and then has come back in. And to some extent, you might say that a problem of inflation is that because it doesn't always measure the same goods, it actually measures, in the situation you might imagine where things are getting better for people, it measures the fact that people are trading up. So, if people start buying butter rather than margarine, more butter will come into the inflation measurement. And therefore, what we'll be measuring is not just inflation, but as kind of a part of a measure of how much better things are getting. And vice versa. When things are getting worse, if people start buying more margarine than butter, then that will come through as a second order effect into the inflation measure.
Okay, you've lost me a little bit on that.
So
does that mean that reflects, so the inflation measure reflects the improvement of some goods because they're bound to cost more?
Yeah, exactly. So it doesn't just measure, if we were all still eating corned beef and lighting our homes in candles, the inflation measure will be very different to the inflation measure we have now, which reflects the fact that we're all eating charcuterie and buying LED light bulbs.
And I suppose it's hard to mitigate for that when you're measuring inflation.
Exactly, because if you just keep measuring the cost of candles, that will be,
I suppose that's and that's a good example because something like candles would have been such a necessity, 200 years ago.
Exactly.
Whereas now they could be quite a luxury item.
Exactly. And again, they're one of the things that went out and came in. So candles, in terms of the candles that you used to have on your bedside because you didn't have a bedside light, went out. But then much, much later, perfumed candles came into the index because they're an essential to any civilised life now, aren't they?
I have a question.
Go on.
I don't know if this is the right time to ask it, but you said inflation's at 3%.
Yeah.
The Bank of England...
Base rate, 3.75%.
No,
that's not you were going to ask,
my
sorry.
question. The Bank of England has a target for 2% inflation.
Right, yes.
Because supposedly no inflation would be a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right, and the idea of 2% inflation is that encourages economic activity.
Yeah.
Now, if 2% is good, 1% is bad, 3% is bad. Is 3% that bad? It doesn't seem to be too far away from the target of 2%.
It doesn't, but with oil now at $100 a barrel, we expect inflation to be maybe 4 or 5% later on this year. So double or more the Bank of England's target. People would disagree as to whether or not you do need inflation in an economy. So that's probably a very long conversation to have. But maybe we'll have it one day.
And just very briefly, the idea, I suppose, of that is that, if you say inflation's at 2% and you're shopping for a fridge, you think, I'll buy it now because it'll have gone up. So it encourages people to be spending money. That's the theory behind it, right?
That's right. That's part of the theory. Yeah, definitely.
Basic idea.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Whereas if you have deflation and the price of goods is going down, you think, I'm not going to buy the fridge now because it's going to be cheaper next week. Yeah. So that's definitely part of the theory.
And just a very quick question for you. Am I right in saying that deflation is worse than inflation in that instance? Like deflation you definitely want to avoid.
Deflation is worse than low inflation. I'm not sure whether deflation is worse than 50, 60, 70% inflation.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Depends what you mean by inflation.
Okay.
Just a tiny bit. The reason I guessed you might be talking about the Bank of England base rate is because inflation is one of the things that the Bank of England take into account when they set that base rate. And the fact that it's not gone down and that it's likely to go up, the inflation is likely to go up, means that it's very unlikely we'll see any more cuts to the base rate this year.
Of interest rates.
Correct. In fact, we're likely to see them going up. So that has an impact on people's mortgages and everything like that, of course. So all that was an aside, because what I wanted to mention was what's changed this year in the basket of goods. And perhaps a little shout out to my ex-colleague Craig, who always puts a little LinkedIn post when these things are announced to remind us that it's quite an interesting thing to look at. So some things have gone out and some things have come in this year. Do you want to hazard any guesses as to what might have come in this year?
Oh, what might have come in? That's a really good question.
Think about my life, Sebastian. Think about the things I might have bought that are quite large ticket items recently.
Thing out there?
Yeah.
Van.
The camper van.
The camper van.
Yeah. So
Camper vans are in.
motorhomes are in.
How do camper vans fit in a basket of goods?
Well, you don't have to fit them all in a
Big-
basket.
It's a big basket, isn't it?
Yeah. There's lots of things that are...
There's something else that's like really in fashion at the moment.
Yeah.
I can't think of anything. I'm not materialistic, so it's really hard for me to think of these things.
Think about changes in people's lives. So we were in a pub last night, weren't we? And what kind of a pub was that?
Kind of a pub.
Yeah. What did it welcome that maybe pubs didn't welcome at one
I
point?
say inn. It's called the Welcome Inn.
It is.
What does it welcome? Card payments? It probably doesn't welcome card payments.
Dogs.
Dogs.
It's dog friendly pub.
I know it's a dog-friendly pub. Would it not have done in the past?
No,
really?
no. Pubs were generally very dog unfriendly. Wetherspoons still is dog unfriendly. It's the worst thing about Wetherspoons, I think. Lots of good things about Wetherspoons. Dog grooming has come in as a new item. Hummus is in, which...
You said that with such disdain. Hummus.
I was only surprised that it hasn't already been in. It feels that hummus has been quite fashionable for
Hummus
quite
is
a
great.
while.
I'll take charcuterie and hummus any day.
Yeah. One of the people I used to work with, who was very set in his ways, was astounded when I told him, after reading the Sunday papers one weekend, did you know that hummus is now the country's favourite dip? And his response was, what? People like it more than Dairy? Which, again, is another example of a bit of a divide.
I was thinking, what, onion and chive or tara masalata?
No.
Tzatziki? No.
Dairy. Have you had Dairy?
Like Dairy Dunkers?
Yeah, like Dairy Dunkers, yeah.
Yeah, I suppose, when I was a kid.
Yeah. It's not something in your basket of goods.
It's not, no.
Okay. So motorhomes are in. Hummus is in. Things that are going out are some of the things that are actually make it quite difficult to measure. So one of the things that's in at the moment is the cost of overnight accommodation in the UK, so cost of hotels. And I would estimate the point that is just so volatile. And, you can get such different deals from shopping around that actually it's really hard to put that in the basket without doing an awful lot of, work to work out what the number you should put in the basket is. So that's going out.
And this is the CPI rate of inflation.
That's
Consumer
right.
Price Index.
Yes.
Are there other ways of measuring inflation?
Yes. So the government's preferred method is actually CPIH. Which is the same. It starts from the same place as CPI, but it adds in some housing costs. So things like, I think, council tax is in it, some housing rental, some mortgage costs are in there. So when you said camper van won't fit in a basket, the basket includes all kinds of intangible things. It's not just things you would pick up on a supermarket shelf. So things like pet insurance, so kind of financial products like that. Things that perhaps you don't think about as being one of the things that you buy, but things like, this is one of the new things that's in it this year actually, is subscriptions to TV channels, to things like Netflix and things like that. That didn't used to be in. That's another example of things that go out and go in. So vinyl records used to be in and then went out.
I'm just wondering if something like Netflix, like I don't know how much it costs, but I know that they introduced a lower tier membership with ads, maybe like $4.99 a month. Or so.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to know, like, how are they measuring that? Because are they taking the
Yeah.
standard plan and that's very much dictated by the business because they have decided plans, or do they say, well, what's the average that someone spends on Netflix?
I don't know the answer to that, but it is a good question. And it is another example of the fact that it's really tricky to measure inflation.
Yeah.
So a couple of other examples that are kind of hinted at in the way that they have changed the index this time. They've taken out a single sheet of wrapping paper because they do have people who actually go around shops and try to buy the basket.
Okay. They have to buy it.
Yes, yeah. They do go out and buy it. And lots of their mystery shoppers, as it were, reported that it's actually quite difficult to buy a single sheet of wrapping paper.
Good.
So that's gone out. And a roll of wrapping paper is in
now
as an alternative. I think one of the things that's been tricky about measuring inflation is how do you incorporate the cost of clothing? So, clothing, it depends on what you buy. So they've been more specific in the new index in exactly what they want you to buy. So, for example, a pair of boys' pyjamas for an 8-year-old boy rather than a pair of children's pyjamas. So, they're being more specific there. And they're also, one of the things I thought was quite interesting that was that a takeaway drink is in the index before and after the changes. But before, it's a takeaway drink that you buy from a supermarket. And afterwards, it's a takeaway drink that you buy from a takeaway outlet. Because people don't generally buy a takeaway drink from the supermarket unless you're on a Tesco meal deal, of course. Other meal deals are available. So changing things like that is also part of the kind of updating and the hygiene factors, if you like, about keeping the index working well.
I have more questions.
Well, yes, yeah.
This feels somewhat unusual because you're talking about like hummus and charcuterie and stuff, and I'm bringing it back to like economic reactions to this. So my question for you is that a lot of the time what you hear from governments is the economy was going great, but then we had the problem of COVID.
Yeah.
Or then we had the problem of Ukraine war. Then we had the problem of the latest one, Iran. And there's always something to fall back on. How much do you think that there is legitimate argument for saying, well, that was kind of out of our hands? We are at the mercy of these big geopolitical events that we can't control. And how much do you think that governments should be blamed for high rates of inflation?
I think one of the things that we talked about with cost of energy is that a lot of the cost of energy in the UK is not the actual cost of getting oil out of the ground or even buying it on the international market. It's all the additional taxes and additions that are made to the price to cover things like the green transition, so on and so forth. So I do think that there are ways in which government could intervene. And Rachel Reeves gave a speech today, or was it yesterday, about there would be some price capping on energy for people on benefits. Because we expect the cost of energy to go up quite significantly because of the rise in the price of oil.
Surely that means that still somebody is still paying these massive prices, but it's just not those people. It becomes the government, which taxpayers. Right?
Exactly. I wasn't suggesting that it's a good thing for Rachel Reeves to do.
No, I'm just
you that she is. So I think the better thing for government to do is to be thinking long term about how we provide an energy source for the UK that is affordable. And we've talked before about the fact that we think that could be nuclear, as well as being re-pumping oil from the North Sea and even reopening some coal mines. So I think government has to take long-term strategic decisions. And obviously you will always be buffeted by things that happen that you weren't aware of. But I think a lot of the reasons for the inflation that we see in our shops is things that could have been addressed by government with a long-term strategic plan, not just by bailing people out. You said it before, didn't you? That you wait for the impact of something, and then you make tiny gestures to reduce it, rather than thinking long term about how you strategically plan so that doesn't happen.
So would I be right in saying you could mitigate the risk of inflation and not be at the mercy of any of these geopolitical conflicts entirely if you just became an autarky and just became completely self-dependent economically? But of course you wouldn't want to do that, because trade is a vital thing for, like we're talking about in the first segment, things with comparative advantages, and to be able to trade with different countries is really important. So therefore, if you became slightly more economically independent, you would have you'd be less at risk of these geopolitical conflicts impacting inflation, but you're still always going to have some ups and downs.
That's right. And obviously there's things we can't make here. You mentioned oranges, but there are lots of things like rare earths. We can't really make those here. We can't mine those here. We haven't got chip making facilities here. And, whilst you could have a long-term strategic aim to make chips, you can't do it tomorrow. So, that would be a long-term thing. So I think the idea that we could become an autarky is a bit, it's a bit of an imaginary leap, really.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody suggesting that, to be honest. I think it's probably something that the free trade, sort of ultra free trade people would suggest anybody that was advocating a little bit of protectionism is actually wanting. But
correct.
So I guess then that this is an argument, probably in both sections of the news today, that we need a bit more economic independence, and we need to be aware of those things and have a conversation about that, rather than just having the default, there is no alternative. We have to have complete open free trade and allow cheap imports to what's the word? To sort of, I can't think of the
overtake.
Word. Overtake, monopolise.
Yeah. And we need
sector.
an industrial strategy, a long-term industrial strategy, including a strategy for energy. And we need a long-term economic strategy. Good.
Excellent.
That's homework.
Should we finish there?
Yes, okay.
Okay, you sent me the task of explaining to anybody who's not aware how they can share our videos.
I did. Yes.
So if you're watching this on YouTube, there is a little button down below where you can click subscribe. There's also a bell icon that you can press, which will give you notifications anytime we release a podcast. And if you'd like to share it, there's a little button where you can share it on WhatsApp or other messaging software to send it to people that you think might enjoy it. And if you're watching it on Spotify, there's also buttons to like and give it you can actually give stars. You always say give 5 stars. I think you can give stars on Spotify or the podcast software. So
Great.
There you go.
So please do that. Thank you very much. And we will see you next week.
See you then.